currently he's the chairman of Covair. He has many other, worked with many other companies, and I will let him talk about it rather than me talking about it. He is also working with many other non-profit organizations. Again, I will let him talk about that, as we are here to listen to him and not to us. So, yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
So first of all, thanks for having me. You know, the word Titan is intimidating. So when I got the first call saying, you know, you'll be speaking, so I said, hey, I'm not a Titan, right? So, and you never, ever talk about yourself, right? So this is the first time that I had to put together my own horn to toot and saying, okay, what am I going to say? And just to make sure I was not too far off, I asked my two daughters, saying, you know, send me an email telling me what you think are my strengths, right? So that I'm bouncing off, you know. Sometimes the kids are very honest. They're brutally honest sometimes. How many of you, some of the younger people have small children, right? But by the time they go to college and they have the freedom to speak, I mean, intellectually with you, right? Yeah. They can be very harsh, right? So, but I think my assessment and their assessment was very close. So what I'm going to do is talk about multiple stages of my life, right? So I am one of the invitees who is at the very, you know, end of his career, okay? You have invited other young people who are bright and coming up and have made millions and so on. But for me, I'm speaking a little bit of history here, of my own career. But the positive aspect of that is that you'll get to learn about the entire life story in a way, okay? Which you may not hear from a 40-year-old, right? So talking from childhood to early schooling to college degree, coming to the US, early career, some of the difficulties, you know, rough times. Then I go into my first startup life. What are the success factors for a startup? What are my personal qualities or traits? Then, after the first startup success, what are some of the other startup successes? And then some of the venture investments, etc., that I was making, and then giving back. Okay? So I'll cover a lot of ground. I was told to talk about some of these things, so even though they may not be relevant in terms of, you know, career or startup, but I was born in Rajkot. My family originates from Bhuj, Kutch. So we are what we call Gurjar Mania, meaning non-Kutchi speaking Kutchi. Okay? So the other Gujaratis think of us as Kutchis, the true Kutchis don't think of us as Kutchi, right? Say, oh, you're the wrong Kutchi. So the family came to Rajkot during the Second World War when they were all, you know, driven away from Burma, partly because it was occupied by the Japanese, and Indians who could come back to Burma did. And so my parents were married in Burma, actually during the blackout days in Rangoon when it was being bombed by the Japanese, right? So they tried to make a living. It was very difficult, much more competitive in Rajkot than in Burma. My father almost had to take up a job in Karachi. At that time, Karachi was a very prosperous, you know, thriving business center. And because it was still undivided India, you could go there. And my grandfather was trying to run a wholesale tea business. There was no rice business in Rajkot, right? In Burma, they were all rice merchants. They struggled. Eventually, in the early 50s, decided to go back to Burma. So in 1952, I went back to Burma. I mean, I shouldn't say I went back because I was born in India, but went to Burma for the first time and stayed there through my high school. And to make a long story short, because they lived in a small town, they were always concerned about the quality of my education. So after third grade, I was sent off to India to live with my uncle in Calcutta. Did that for a while, then came back to Rangoon again, because my uncle, being a government servant, was getting transferred. So again, that was instability for me. So came back, stayed alone in Rangoon with my cousin in an office setting. So think of a 13, 14-year-old by then, 7th grade, 6th grade. So by the day the office was on, so we couldn't really sleep or do anything, right? So at night we would have the office facility accessible for homework, etc. And then we used to eat in a mess, right? And then later on, my uncle, the other uncle, established a home in a suburb of Rangoon, and I lived with them. And then later on, my mother came from the small town to Rangoon to establish our own household. So that is how I finished high school. So those of you who have children and are talking about Harker versus, the best public schools in Cupertino or Saratoga, don't work that hard. if I given my story, I wouldn't have been a flunky, right? I wouldn't have made it this far. So the thing to emphasize though with your kids are the values, whether they're doing their homework, whatever they're supposed to do, are they doing or not? And with that, making sure that they're progressing. Yes, everything helps. There's always a discussion between Harvard versus Berkeley, right? Is a private college better than a public, best public college for you? So this is what I learned. What it taught me was independent, okay? By the time you're 13, if you're going away and have to make your own decisions, right? So very independent decision making, and I did that all the way through after that, right? Accepting things as they come, exposure to many locations. So I was born in Rajkot. My father had TB, and so we had to go to Miraj for a year to live there until he got operated. Went to a small town called Prom in Burma, stayed for a while in Rangoon, and about a year and a half of schooling in Calcutta, right? So by the time I was in high school, I had exposure to all these places, and I spoke Burmese fluently, and besides English, Hindi, etc. by the time you finished high school. So the multiplicity of experiences, I think, is somewhat, it has its value. It may have its aspect of instability, but it also teaches a person how to behave in multiple environments. Okay, so college. I didn't have formal Burmese language training in school. I could read, write, etc., but it wasn't that I had learned Burmese formally in school, and because most of the Indian schools in Burma used to follow the West Bengal Secondary Board curriculum. Since we were close to Calcutta, that is the syllabus we used to follow. And so that, of course, didn't include Burmese as a language, right? So the Burmese university would not admit me. My father's idea was that we're going to live in Burma forever. Right? Unfortunately, that didn't happen, or fortunately, whatever. So I had to come to India all of a sudden at the last minute. And so being the fact that the Calcutta results, timing, etc. is different from Bombay, I was forced to come to Calcutta. Attended St. Davis College, and then later on went to Jadavpur University, did my engineering, etc. In the process, learned good Bengali, by the way. And then my my life in Calcutta was very, very focused to study. Okay? I used to live alone with a roommate. We both used to eat at the same place. So, total dedication to studies. In fact, my friends used to think that I'm a very boring guy. The only time I would agree to go to movies would be in the night shows when all my work is done, and so on. So, did well in school. Coming to Calcutta from a small town again was intimidating. Okay, this huge place. When I first arrived, actually, I came with my grandmother when I was 13 or so. The first time I came. So, Esplanade area. Anybody been to Calcutta? Okay. So Esplanade area is all lighted, bright, So I asked my grandmother, right? So never seen such crowds of people in Burma. So very intimidating environment. And that day my uncle didn't show up to pick us up at the airport because some miscommunication. In those days we were sending telegrams, right? So, some of you, by the way, may not even know that, right? And officially last year, Indian Post and Telegraph has stopped sending telegrams. Right? You cannot go to post office in India and send a telegram, right? Again, what lesson did I learn, right? So, I think in engineering college, the most important thing was understanding the fundamentals. Right? I was very, very dedicated to make sure I understood them. And the reason being that, at the high school level, yeah, I had exposure to science and so on, but not such a high level of science. Right? So I just want to make sure that I was not missing anything. So in Calcutta, I think the same word probably is used in other colleges in India. Students who have fundamentals clear are called people with funda, right? So guys who don't attend lectures, don't write notes, right? Guys who are sitting in the canteen all the time, right? Would come to me and I have my notes, right? I can explain what happened, right? So that was the most interesting part of going through engineering college for me because everything was a challenge. And if you didn't keep up with it, one other thing I realized, by the way, that a lot of these people who sat in the canteen but, did well in the exams were very bright. I mean, they were brighter than me, I immediately realized. Because with a lot less work, they were still succeeding. So I'm saying, hey, why is it taking me so long, right? So I must be thicker than that. So that's why I was always trying hard. Then hard work, as I mentioned, and focus. Didn't get it distracted with anything in Calcutta. However, I did build a remote correspondence relationship with the person who is my wife. Used to write letters to her, and over the years, fell in love, and eventually we got married. So that was one other accomplishment of my college days. Okay, so marriage and US education. So since we knew each other, we got engaged early, right after my college. Then when I wanted to come here, the dilemma was whether I get married or not. I didn't want to get married. I said, let me go, come back in 2 years. So her parents are not willing to believe that. And my parents said, if it was our daughter, we would feel the same way. So you should get married. So here I'm getting married without a penny of income, without a job, totally depending on my father. Even if I want to take Rekha to dinner, it was on his money, not my money, right? So very embarrassing type of feeling to get married. But we did that. Came here alone, of course. At that time, it was not that easy because I was coming on loans. after leaving Burma, my father had lost most of his money for two reasons. All the businesses were nationalized, and all the big currency was demonetized in Burma. And even whatever money you had, if you wanted to send it to India, there was about a 5-to-1 ratio. So you give 5 times the chats in Burma, and you get, if you give 500, you get 100. And so in the early 2-3 years of my college, I had to do tuitions to, keep myself supported. But once I was in Madison and realized how cold it was, luckily though, after one semester I got a teaching assistantship and was able to bring Rekha, and we both lived there through the rest of my stay to finish my master's degree. But because of weather, immediately decided that I'm going to go to California. Didn't look for a job in the Midwest, didn't go to Chicago, et cetera, et cetera. So, however, the first 2 jobs for me, again, if I go back to history, you'd say, how did I make it here? First job, at that time, this was the time when Vietnam War was winding down, early 70s, right? Most defense companies were laying off people. And so all the subcontractors who supplied components or whatever electronics to the defense companies were having some tough times. So the first job that I got, within a year the company went under. It took 2-3 months again to get another job. A few months later the same thing happened to that small company. So I seriously at that time thought about going back to India, saying, US is not working for me.
What year was that?
This is 72 time frame. No, I'm sorry, 70, 71. Then it so happened that one of my bosses from the last company that went under got a job in Sunnyvale. Bill Whitworth is his name. Don't know if he's living anymore or not, but he called me. Said I may have a job for you. So that's how I became a Bay Area resident in 1971. Worked for this company called Applied Technology for about 2.5 years. They were making, those of you who are in electronics, hybrid microcircuit modules for defense. So they used to make a system called ALR-45 that was in the cockpit of a fighter that would detect radar signals. So anybody following that aircraft on radar, the pilot would immediately know and take whatever evasive actions. So that miniaturization needed a lot of hybrid circuits. So I worked in that, but while doing that, realized that this can be a long-term thing. This is an interconnect technology that's someday going to be replaced. So I didn't have a strong background in electronics for my master's degree because I was too hung up on learning control theory. Control theory is all math. By the time I was done with about 4 classes for my master's degree, I realized that all I learned was mathematics, not really engineering. Okay? Because you were solving all kinds of equations for optimization and for, stability and this and that. Anyway, so I felt that I had to increase, if I was to succeed in this valley, I need to know analog circuits, digital circuits, IC technology and all. So early morning program in Santa Clara, I think it still runs. They call it the early bird program. 7 to 9, you go get the graduate level classes. So I took about 4 of those classes over these 2 years that I was working at Applied to feel that, okay, now I would be able to go interview at Fairchild or National. These were the top semiconductor companies of the day, to even meaningfully interview them, right? So did that with 3 companies, Motorola, National, and Fairchild. And out of that, I chose Fairchild. and became part of their product engineering group in the analog circuits. And from then on, I never had to look back for my career. Because with all this instability that I had, almost, no money, few months at the unemployment office, it leaves a very negative impact on your mental state. So when I got this job at Fairchild, I mean, even applied technology was a good job, right? But I didn't think of it as a long-term career job. Plus defense was always something I didn't care for. Meaning, yeah, it's there, you'll have a job, but the red tape and all the things that go on in a defense company, very bureaucratic. A guy like me would not survive there. So, once I was at Fairchild, the semiconductor technology was very up and coming, right? Why this thing is called Silicon Valley. So the Fairchild, National, AMD, Intel, all these were, except for Fairchild, which was an established company, Intel, AMD, National, they were all considered, advanced stage startups then. Okay? So a lot of opportunities. But because I had been burned by the instability, I stayed put at Fairchild. Didn't want to move, right? People who are leaving would leave, and then a year or two later, they'll come back and say, hey, it's the same, right? They go with great enthusiasm and saying, I'm going to Intel. 2 years later, when you talk to them, you say, it's about the same, right? So that way, I spent 11 years at Fairchild. Unusual in the chip industry. But I grew through the ranks, did all kinds of jobs, got very diversified. The last job I ran was an operations job where ran actually again a military components operation, which had about 300 people. So everything except sales and marketing was part of my job. And so in those 11 years, I did engineering, I did quality and reliability. I was quality reliability director for the whole division. Got to travel to every Fairchild plant overseas. I mean, that you cannot believe an experience that you can get from a job like that. Right? At that time, the Japanese were becoming a big story in the chip industry quality. Because when CEO of HP, Andrew Young, publicly makes a statement that Americans are not able to provide the same memory quality as we get from the Japanese, right? So the American management of the chip industry was really shaken up. About the same time, I was given this quality job, saying go fix the quality, because we had customers in Japan. Fairchild was one of the few companies qualified to supply to NTT at that time. Okay? But the distributor would send us parts back. Every week we get some parts back saying, hey, these regulators are not marked properly, there's a pinhole here, the leads are bent, there's tarnish on the leads. So all these things we said, this is external, has nothing to do with the working of the chip. Why are they complaining, right? But they wanted a perfect part, right? So anyway, I learned a lot. I went to Japan several times to meet these people and say, okay, tell me why this is not good, and so on. So the quality job taught me everything about making semiconductors from incoming wafers to outgoing product, right? And so by that time, I was very ripe for a startup company to be hired, right? And it so happened that my boss at Fairchild, who had left a year and a half or so ago, had become CEO of Altera. How many of you know of Altera? So, 84 was the year when Altera was in its second year. And so I was recruited to become the operations director of Altera. to actually help them make the chips. And this was a new concept then, what we call fabless companies now, where Altera, Xilinx, and Chips and Technology, these were the three first startup companies with a fabless model, right? So with my knowledge of the entire process, I could at least go to vendor and tell them what we want, because we're not making anything in-house, right? And on the other hand, convince the customers. So if I have a customer in Fujitsu or HP or Hitachi or AT&T here, you have to really convince them that you as a startup without your own manufacturing will be able to meet their demand. And how are you going to do that? So unless you know the entire process, you cannot do that. A sales guy cannot do that, a marketing guy cannot do that. So I became the ambassador for Altera in visiting all these companies, right? And I was able to build a type of a rapport with the customers, and Japanese customers in particular, very, very detail-oriented, right? So if you cannot satisfy them in detail, they're not going to trust you, right? So all this knowledge of 11 years at Fairchild came to real use. Every visit I went, I felt that, okay, I was able to answer the question. So, I guess I've lost track of my, where am I? Yeah, early career continued. Yeah. So one of the stories of this 11 years, lesson is rolling stone gathers no moss, right? So people these days want to leave companies every 2 years. I was interviewing actually a person in Calcutta, Kober, in an office in Calcutta, India. Had a job at Wipro, had a job somewhere else. 2, 3 nice names, right? In 3 years. And he's coming and talking to me. I said, tell me, why should I hire you? He was never expecting this kind of question, you know, very, very harsh question. Say, hey, if you've gone to 3 companies in 3 years, right? At Wipro you stayed only 6 months. Why should I hire you? What makes me, confident that you'll even stay here, right? He didn't have a good answer. I said, all of you young people are running after these salary increments of 15%, 20% here. Think seriously. And by the way, any of you who are doing that, same message, right? When I look at a resume, when I'm hiring somebody, every 2 years, moved somewhere, it tells me either this person is not getting satisfaction out of any job, or he's incompetent, and people are taking 2 years to find that out and firing him, right? Then he goes on to another place. And there are a lot of people. Okay? So be very careful in how your resume looks, because it cannot be, a moving type of a resume. Okay? So rolling stone gathers no moss, and so if you're learning and growing, see, this is why I didn't leave Fairchild compared to others, right? I was satisfied with the compensation, being taken care of, I used to think that your bosses made a lot more money than you, right? And one day, accidentally at Fairchild, my boss and I shared office, right? So his paycheck was lying, right? And I found out that, okay, he's making only 12-15% more than me, right? So what's the big deal about salary? Salary is there. If you're getting paid properly, that's fine, but you shouldn't jump to get a 15% raise, right? Because next year you'll be there. And it was a rule at Fairchild that every promotion, the standard raise was 7%. So if you got promoted from a senior engineer to a supervising engineer, you get 7%, right? Your base about and 7%. Next review, whatever happens will happen. So don't change the job for the sake of change, because you say I'm bored here. Not good for your career. Okay. So talking about management, right? So I know everyone is not going to start a company, but if you want to grow in a management capacity, first thing, again, continuing on my last point, stability and commitment.